When my son got married, I kept a $90 million trust fund, completely secret. My late wife left it to me, and I never breathed a word of it to anyone. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made in my entire 70 years of life. Because exactly 7 days after the wedding, his new wife showed up uninvited at my front door, with a slick corporate lawyer at her side. What she demanded, and what I eventually discovered, shattered my world. But they made one fatal mistake. They thought my gray hair meant I was defenseless. If you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe because you will not believe how this ends. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired mechanical engineer, and for the last 4 decades, I have lived a quiet, unassuming life in a modest ranch-style home in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. It is a house built on memories. Every wooden floorboard, every creaking door hinge holds a piece of the life I shared with my late wife, Evelyn. When she passed away, she left behind a massive fortune from the sale of her technology patents. $90 million safely locked away in a private trust that only I controlled. But I never touched it. I continued to live on my basic pension, driving my old pickup truck and keeping the wealth a closely guarded secret. I wanted my son Lucas to learn the value of hard work. I wanted him to build his own life just like I did. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had stood in a tuxedo and watched Lucas marry Monica. The air was already thick with the familiar Texas heat. I was in my living room peacefully repairing the gears of an antique grandfather clock. The rhythmic ticking of the brass components was the only sound in the house. I had my reading glasses resting on the bridge of my nose, my hands stained with a little bit of oil, completely lost in the simple joy of fixing something broken. Then the silence was shattered by the aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. I looked up through the front window. A pristine black Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway, coming to a halt right behind my weathered truck. The engine cut off and the doors opened. Out stepped Monica, my new daughter-in-law. She was wearing a sharp designer white suit, her eyes hidden behind oversized dark sunglasses. She did not look like a woman dropping by to bring her father-in-law some leftover wedding cake. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight. Out of the driver's side stepped a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a tailored navy blue suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable predatory posture of a corporate lawyer. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out onto the porch, the wooden planks groaning familiarly under my boots. I offered a warm, welcoming smile, assuming there was some sort of post-wedding errand they needed help with. "Monica," I called out, shielding my eyes from the morning sun. "This is a surprise. Where is Lucas?" Monica did not smile back. She did not take off her sunglasses. She walked up the stone pathway, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a physical distance between us as if I were carrying a contagious disease. She did not say a single word of greeting. Instead, she gestured slightly with her hand, signaling the man beside her to take over. The man stepped onto my porch. He did not extend a hand to shake mine. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and dropped it onto the small patio table next to my rocking chair. The thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said. His voice was cold, rehearsed, and completely devoid of any human empathy. "My name is Bradley Thorne. I am the legal counsel representing the new owners of this property. I am here to formally serve you notice." I frowned, genuinely confused. I looked from the envelope to Bradley and then to Monica. "New owners? What on earth are you talking about?" "I have owned this house for 40 years. The mortgage was paid off 2 decades ago." Bradley adjusted his tie, looking at me with a mixture of pity and extreme annoyance. "Not anymore, sir. This property has been legally transferred and sold. The asset is currently in the process of being liquidated. You have exactly 72 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still occupying this structure by 8 in the morning on Friday, the local sheriff will be called to forcibly remove you for trespassing on private property." The words hung in the air. 72 hours. Vacate. Trespassing. I felt a sudden sharp ringing in my ears. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to process the absurd string of sentences this stranger had just spoken to me. I looked at Monica. She was staring past me, inspecting a chipped paint spot on the porch railing, looking completely bored by the destruction of my life. "Monica," I said, my voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "What is this? Where is my son?" She finally shifted her gaze to me. She let out a heavy sigh as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Lucas is busy at the office, Harrison. He could not be here to deal with this drama. The house is sold. It is done. Bradley is just doing his job. You need to start packing instead of standing there asking pointless questions." My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a sudden, terrifying adrenaline rush. I reached down and picked up the manila envelope. I tore it open. Inside was a stack of legal documents: deeds of trust, transfer of ownership forms, sale agreements. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, looking for any explanation, any reason for this madness. Then I flipped to the last page. My breath caught in my throat. At the bottom of the page was a red county notary seal. Right next to it was a power of attorney declaration granting full legal authority to liquidate all real estate assets in my name. And right above the dotted line was my signature: Harrison Caldwell. It was a perfect match. The sweeping loops of the letters, the sharp angles. It was exactly how I signed my checks, my tax returns, my contracts. It was flawless. Except for one massive, horrifying detail: I had never signed that paper. I stared at the black ink. The realization crashed into me like a freight train. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding with the bank. This was a deliberate, calculated, and highly illegal forgery. And there was only one person in the world who had access to my old tax returns and filing cabinets to trace that signature so perfectly. My own flesh and blood. My son, Lucas. Bradley tapped his expensive watch. "I strongly suggest you start calling moving companies Mr. Caldwell. The new buyers are eager to begin renovations. I will leave my card on the table. Do not try to contact my clients regarding this matter again. Any further communication will be handled exclusively through my office." He placed a glossy white business card next to the envelope. Monica turned on her heel, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone path, and walked back to the Mercedes without looking back. Bradley followed her, getting into the driver's side. The engine roared to life and the SUV reversed out of my driveway, kicking up a cloud of white dust before disappearing down the suburban street. I stood alone on my porch. The Texas sun was beating down on my shoulders, but my entire body felt ice cold. My own son and his wife of 1 week had just ambushed me. They had forged a federal document. They had stolen the house I built with my own hands. They were throwing me out onto the street like a stray dog, believing I was just a poor, defenseless old pensioner who would have no choice but to surrender. I looked down at the forged signature again. A strange, eerie calm began to wash over me. The shock was fading, replaced by the analytical precision of a man who had spent his life solving complex mechanical failures. They thought I was weak. They thought I was naive. They had absolutely no idea about the $90 million monster they had just woken up. I folded the document, slipped it back into the envelope, and walked back inside the house. I had a phone call to make. I stepped through the front door and closed it quietly behind me. The heavy oak door shut with a solid, familiar click, sealing out the oppressive Texas heat and the lingering dust kicked up by Monica's departing Mercedes. Inside the house was perfectly still, save for the rhythmic, steady ticking of the grandfather clock I had been repairing just minutes earlier. It was a sound that had always brought me peace, a mechanical heartbeat that grounded me to this space. But now each tick felt like a relentless countdown. 72 hours. That was all the time they had given me. 3 short days to erase 40 years of my life. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my boots scuffing softly against the hardwood floors that Evelyn and I had painstakingly laid down ourselves. I placed the manila envelope on the cold granite island. The air conditioning hummed to life, sending a sudden chill over my sweat-dampened shirt. I did not panic. I did not throw things or shout into the empty rooms. That is simply not how my mind works. Decades of engineering had trained me to approach sudden catastrophes with cold, detached logic. When a heavy bridge collapses or a vital turbine fails, you do not waste time crying over the wreckage. You isolate the structural weakness. You find the exact point of failure. My point of failure, it seemed, was my blind, unconditional trust in my own son. I pulled out one of the heavy wooden bar stools and sat down. My hands, still bearing faint traces of dark oil from the clock gears, reached for the documents. I pulled the papers out of the envelope again and spread them carefully across the smooth stone surface. The transfer of ownership, the quitclaim deed, the aggressive eviction notice. I lined them up with the precise, methodical care of a man reading a complex blueprint. I leaned in, my eyes fixing intently on the final page of the main legal packet. The power of attorney declaration. It was dated a little over a month ago. I ran my calloused index finger over the signature at the bottom. Harrison Caldwell. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception. Whoever had done this had not simply rushed through a sloppy imitation. They had studied my handwriting with a terrifying dedication. The slight upward slant of the capital H, the deliberate sharp cross of the T in my last name, the way the dark ink trailed off at the very end of the double L. It was all there. A casual observer, even a standard bank teller, would have approved it without a second thought. But I knew my own hand. And more importantly, I knew the physical mechanics of ink on paper. The pressure applied to the pen was wrong. The signature lacked the fluid, unbroken momentum of a man effortlessly writing his own name. It was carefully drawn, not written. But knowing it was a calculated forgery was only the first step. The more pressing question was how they had managed to orchestrate this entire scheme. Monica, with her tailored designer suits and entitled smirk, was certainly cunning enough to conceive the idea. Her chilling, condescending smile on the porch replayed vividly in my mind. She had looked at me not as a father-in-law, but as an annoying, obsolete obstacle standing directly between her and a massive payday. She had stood there casually examining her expensive manicure while her lawyer handed down a swift death sentence to my peaceful retirement. But Monica did not have access to my private filing cabinets. Monica did not know where I securely kept my old tax returns, my property deeds, or my personal identification documents. Only one person had the keys to this house. Only one person knew my daily routines, my private habits, and my schedule. Lucas, my son, the boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle in the very driveway he was now trying to ruthlessly steal. The betrayal began to crystallize in my mind, rapidly hardening into something incredibly sharp and dangerous. I thought back to the lawyer Bradley Thorne. He had handed me that threatening card with the cold, calculated efficiency of a corporate executioner. He had explicitly mentioned a large moving crew arriving on Monday at exactly 8 in the morning. Why Monday? I asked myself, staring blankly at the kitchen wall. Why the intensely aggressive 72-hour timeline? In the ruthless world of commercial real estate and legal evictions, 72 hours is an impossibly narrow window. It is intentionally designed to induce immediate panic. It is a psychological warfare tactic meant to completely overwhelm the victim, forcing them to frantically scramble for moving boxes instead of securing a competent defense lawyer. They desperately wanted me disoriented. They wanted me exhausted and deeply humiliated, hauling black trash bags into the back of my old pickup truck before the weekend was even over. They knew perfectly well that if I had enough time to think clearly, if I had sufficient time to boldly contest the eviction through the proper legal channels, their fraudulent power of attorney would not hold up for a single second. under the strict scrutiny of a federal judge. The aggressive speed of their sudden attack was their only real tactical advantage. They were relying entirely on the arrogant assumption that a 70-year-old widower seemingly living on a modest fixed pension income would completely lack the massive financial resources and the emotional stamina required to fight back against a slick, well-funded corporate law firm. They wrongly assumed I would simply bow my tired head, pack my cherished memories into cheap cardboard boxes, and quietly disappear into whatever miserable low-income housing facility I could manage to afford. I leaned back heavily in the wooden bar stool and let out a slow, steady, calculated breath. The antique grandfather clock in the living room chimed the quarter hour. It was a beautiful, deeply resonant sound. I was not going anywhere. The naive, overly trusting father who had proudly stood in a tuxedo at his son's lavish wedding exactly 7 days ago was permanently gone. He had officially died on that front porch the precise moment Monica stubbornly refused to take off her dark sunglasses. In his place was a resolute man who secretly possessed a hidden $90 million fortune and the limitless patience required to systematically dismantle their entire criminal operation, piece by piece. I carefully gathered the fraudulent legal documents and slid them neatly back into the thick manila envelope. I stood up from the kitchen island, feeling a strange, powerful, undeniable surge of energy coursing rapidly through my veins. The crucial first phase of my strategic response required absolute, unwavering emotional control. I needed to hear my son's voice. I needed to hear exactly how he would cowardly attempt to justify this sudden nightmare. I walked deliberately over to the old landline phone securely mounted on the kitchen wall. I stared at the worn plastic buttons for a moment, steadying my racing heart. I picked up the heavy receiver, listened to the steady, hollow dial tone, took one final deep breath to completely mask my burning anger, and dialed Lucas's number. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. "Dad," Lucas finally said. His tone was remarkably calm. There was no surprise in his voice. Absolutely no hesitation. He sounded exactly like a man waiting for a scripted cue. "Lucas," I said, allowing my voice to tremble just enough to sound overwhelmed. "What is happening? Monica was just here. She brought a lawyer. They handed me papers saying I have to leave my house in 3 days. Please tell me this is some kind of terrible misunderstanding." I waited for the crack in his facade. Instead, I heard a heavy theatrical sigh. "Dad." "Please calm down," Lucas said softly. "I know this is a shock. I wanted to be there to tell you in person, but I was afraid of how you would react. I could not bear to see you upset. But we had to do this. We had no other choice." "No other choice," I echoed, leaning heavily against the granite countertop to sell the illusion of a broken man, even though he could not see me. "This is my home. You forged my signature, Lucas. You sold my house." "Dad, stop it," he interrupted gently. "Do not say things like that. Nobody forged anything. You signed those papers last month. You just do not remember doing it." The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. "I do not remember," I asked, letting my voice crack perfectly. "What are you talking about?" "It is not, Dad," Lucas replied, his tone shifting into the patronizing cadence one might use to address a frightened child. "We have talked about this. The doctor warned Monica and me that your dementia is rapidly advancing. You are having severe memory lapses. You are becoming a danger to yourself." "Dementia," I repeated, genuinely stunned by the depth of his fabrication. "I have never been diagnosed with dementia in my life. I have not even seen Dr. Aris in over a year for anything other than a routine cholesterol check." "Dad, you are in denial," Lucas continued smoothly. "Do you not remember the gas stove incident last week? You left the burner on high. You nearly burned the entire house down. If Monica and I had not stopped by to check on you, you could have died. We cannot let you live alone anymore. It is simply not safe." I closed my eyes. The gas stove incident. The memory played back in my mind with crystal clarity. Lucas had come over to make us a pot of soup. He had specifically asked me to go out to the garage to find an old socket wrench for him. While I was outside, he must have cranked the burner up intentionally, letting the broth boil over onto the open flame. He orchestrated a fire hazard just to build a fake medical narrative against me. He had laid the groundwork for this betrayal right in front of my face. I vividly remembered wiping the greasy soot off the expensive ceramic stovetop after they abruptly rushed out the door. I did not leave the stove on Lucas, I whispered, injecting a note of desperate pleading into my tone. You were cooking the soup. You asked me to go to the garage. See, this is exactly what the doctor warned us about, Lucas said, his voice brimming with counterfeit heartbreak. You are fabricating memories to cover up the blanks. You are confusing the details, Dad. It breaks my heart to hear you like this. It really does. But it only proves that Monica and I made the right decision. We sold the house to secure you a spot in a premier assisted living facility. We took the equity and paid for a comprehensive care package. You will have round-the-clock medical supervision, hot meals, and a safe environment. We did this to save your life. A premier assisted living facility. The words sounded luxurious, responsible, and incredibly fake. I knew exactly how much my house was worth, and I knew how much those facilities cost. The math did not add up. If they had truly secured a place for me, they would have involved me in the transition. They would not have sent a corporate lawyer with a 72-hour eviction notice and a threat involving the local sheriff. Lucas, please, I said, forcing a sob into my throat. You cannot force me out of my home. I built this house with your mother. Her garden is here. Her memories are here. You cannot just pack me away like an old piece of furniture. I waited in the heavy silence, wondering if the mention of his mother would pierce his armor. Evelyn had adored Lucas. She had spoiled him, protected him, and believed he would grow into a man of honor. For a brief second, the line was completely quiet. Dad, Mom is gone, Lucas finally said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion now. The sympathy had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard pragmatism. And if she were here, she would want you to be safe. She would agree with us. You are no longer capable of making adult decisions. You are sick. You need to accept that. The cruelty of using his dead mother to justify his crime was the final confirmation I needed. My son was gone. The boy I raised had been entirely replaced by a desperate, greedy stranger willing to discard me for a quick payday. The movers will be there on Monday morning at 8 sharp. Lucas continued, stepping fully into his role as the absolute authority. You need to have your clothes and personal items packed. Do not try to take any of the large furniture or appliances. Those were included in the sale of the property. Monica will bring by a rental car to drive you to the new facility. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Dad. We are doing this out of love. We want what is best for you. I took a slow, steady breath. I gripped the receiver tightly, feeling the hard plastic against my palm. I had to swallow every instinct that screamed at me to expose his lies, to tell him I knew about the forgery, to promise him ruin. But I needed more time. I needed to execute my plan flawlessly. Okay, Lucas, I whispered, sounding utterly defeated. Okay. I will pack my things. I am just so confused. I am so tired. I know, Dad, he replied smoothly. Just rest. We will handle everything. He hung up. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the wall hook. The soft plastic click echoed through the empty hallway. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. They had successfully stolen my past, and they believed they had completely dictated my entire future. They were absolutely terribly mistaken. I walked over to the kitchen sink and splashed cold water onto my face. I dried my hands on a cotton towel, staring at my reflection in the window pane above the faucet. I was old, yes, but I was far from finished. The real war had only just begun. I stood there by the kitchen sink, the cool water slowly dripping from my chin, physically grounding me in the immediate present moment. The sheer audacity of Lucas's words still echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet room. Dementia. He had planted that terrible seed with such casual, calculated precision. I dried my face completely with a cotton towel, intentionally letting the rough fabric pull me back from the dangerous edge of blind rage. As a retired mechanical engineer, I had spent my entire professional career diagnosing massive, catastrophic structural failures. When a complex system completely breaks down, you do not simply stare at the surrounding wreckage and shout uselessly at the twisted metal. You carefully trace the microscopic fault lines all the way back to their very origin. You look for the tiny stress fractures that silently appeared long before the final devastating collapse. My own son was not just lying to cover up a spontaneous, opportunistic theft. He was ruthlessly executing a meticulously designed long-term strategy. He had been quietly laying the foundation for my supposed mental decline for weeks, perfectly preparing the medical narrative, so that when the final blow eventually fell, no one in the world would ever question his motives. The burning anger inside my chest began to crystallize, freezing into a sharp, crystalline clarity. I deliberately walked away from the sink and sat back down on the heavy wooden bar stool. I needed to systematically dissect his alibi. I needed to critically examine the structural integrity of his elaborate lies. And the central weight-bearing pillar of his entire fabrication was the terrifying incident with the gas stove. I closed my eyes and allowed the memory of that specific afternoon to play back in my mind, frame by frame, examining every tiny detail I had previously overlooked. It had happened exactly 10 days ago. Lucas had stopped by the house completely unannounced on a random Thursday afternoon. He had cheerfully brought 2 bags of premium organic groceries, insisting that he wanted to cook his old man a healthy batch of homemade vegetable soup. It had seemed like such a rare, deeply touching gesture of filial affection at the time. I had sat at this very kitchen island, happily watching him chop carrots and celery, feeling a warm, familiar swell of pride for the son I had raised. He had filled the large stainless steel pot, placed it directly on the front right burner, and ignited the bright blue flame. Then came the crucial pivot. The exact moment the microscopic stress fracture occurred. Lucas had turned to me, calmly wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, and asked a highly specific question. He casually asked if I still had that specific set of metric socket wrenches securely stored out in the garage. He confidently claimed he desperately needed to borrow them to fix a loose rattling bracket on Monica's expensive car. He knew exactly where I kept them, buried at the very bottom of my heavy steel toolbox, in the darkest, most cluttered corner of the detached garage. It was a tedious task that would take me at least 10 or 15 minutes to properly complete. I had smiled, genuinely happy to be useful to my son, and walked out the back door without a single trace of suspicion. The very moment my boot stepped outside onto the concrete, the deadly trap was set into motion. While I was struggling in the stifling, oppressive heat of the garage, shifting heavy metal trays, and blindly searching for the specific metric sockets, Lucas had not been waiting patiently in the kitchen. He had intentionally turned the gas burner up to its absolute maximum setting. He had coldly ensured the soup would boil over rapidly, effectively drowning the open flame, while leaving the heavy toxic gas freely pumping into the enclosed kitchen space. And then he simply walked out the front door and drove his car away. He did not bother to say goodbye. He did not wait for the wrenches he supposedly needed. He completely abandoned the house, leaving his own father to walk back inside to a kitchen, rapidly filling with highly combustible, suffocating smoke. I vividly remembered coughing violently, my eyes watering intensely, as the shrill, deafening shriek of the smoke alarms suddenly pierced my ears. I had rushed forward in a panic, desperately waving a dish towel to clear the thick gray fog, and twisted the plastic knob to firmly shut off the hissing gas line. Less than 5 minutes later, Lucas and Monica had burst violently through the front door, panting heavily and looking completely terrified. They convincingly claimed they had driven halfway down the street, realized they had forgotten to say a proper goodbye, and turned around just in time to see the dark smoke pouring from the kitchen window. They had rushed directly to my side, grabbing my shaking shoulders, acting deeply traumatized by the event. Lucas had looked me dead in the eye and asked with perfect heartbreaking sincerity why I had turned the stove up so high and carelessly wandered off. I had been so utterly disoriented by the thick smoke and the blaring alarms that I had actually doubted my own memory. I had apologized to them. I had apologized genuinely, believing I had made a foolish, incredibly dangerous mistake due to my advancing age. Now sitting alone in the absolute silence of my kitchen, the horrific truth slammed into my chest with devastating, undeniable force. It was not a lapse in my memory. It was a carefully staged crime scene. Lucas had orchestrated a potentially lethal fire hazard just to forcefully manufacture a documented incident of my supposed cognitive decline. He was aggressively building a fake medical history, a solid paper trail of incompetence to legally justify his fraudulent power of attorney. He had actively risked my life simply to steal my home. The realization was so profoundly dark and twisted that it immediately stripped away every last lingering trace of paternal affection. My son was operating with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a corporate predator. If I simply marched over to his house right now, wildly waving my arms and shouting loudly about forgeries and staged fires, I would be playing directly into his carefully crafted deceptive narrative. I would look exactly like a paranoid, deeply confused old man suffering from aggressive, late-stage dementia. The local authorities would look at his perfectly forged legal documents, listen to his remarkably sympathetic, practiced lies about the kitchen fire, and kindly escort me away to the psychiatric ward. Fighting them with honest, righteous outrage was a guaranteed, undeniable path to total ruin. I could not use brute force to win this battle. I had to use complete deception. I remained seated at the island, staring at the empty air, actively embracing my new reality. I had officially gone undercover in my own life. They wanted a helpless, compliant victim, and I was going to give them an award-winning performance. My son thought he was the master architect of my ultimate demise, completely unaware that he had just willingly handed me the exact blueprints to his own total destruction. I stepped away from the wooden barstool, leaving the kitchen island, to walk down the hall toward my private study. The heavy silence of the house pressed against my shoulders, but my mind was operating with a sharp, singular focus. I needed my tools. A mechanical engineer never relies solely on the naked eye when investigating a catastrophic structural failure. He relies on precision. I opened the top drawer of my heavy oak desk and pulled out my silver-framed reading glasses, settling them firmly onto the bridge of my nose. Right beside them lay my old jeweler magnifying loupe, a small, heavy brass instrument I had used for decades to inspect hairline fractures in aircraft-grade titanium. I picked it up, feeling its comforting weight in my palm, and walked deliberately back into the kitchen. I pulled the thick manila envelope back toward me and carefully slid out the stack of legal documents. I set aside the eviction notice and the transfer of ownership deed, isolating the single most important piece of paper in the entire stack. The power of attorney declaration. I smoothed the white sheet flat against the cool granite countertop. I leaned over, fitting the brass magnifying loupe over my right eye, and brought my face just a few inches from the paper. I had already confirmed that the signature itself was a masterful forgery, a near-perfect tracing of my own handwriting. But a signature alone does not make a legal document binding. It requires a witness. It requires a state seal. I dragged my focus away from the ink of my fake signature and slowly scanned down to the bottom left corner of the page. There, pressed sharply into the paper, was the official circular stamp of a Texas notary public. I adjusted the angle of the overhead kitchen lights to illuminate the faint embossed ridges of the blue ink. I read the tiny typed print inside the circular seal. The notary name was completely unfamiliar to me, likely a corrupt associate Bradley Thorne kept on his payroll specifically for dirty tasks like this. But it was not the name that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the date block located just below the seal. The printed text clearly stated that I, Harrison Caldwell, had personally appeared before this notary in Dallas, Texas. The date typed on the official line was August 14th. I stared at that specific date through the magnifying glass, letting the numbers burn themselves into my memory. August 14th. I slowly pulled the brass loop away from my eye and set it down onto the granite counter. A cold, hard smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. My son was incredibly intelligent, holding an advanced business degree and managing high-level corporate accounts. He had meticulously planned this entire fraudulent takeover, staging a kitchen fire to build a fake medical history and hiring a ruthless lawyer to execute the eviction. But in his arrogant rush to steal my home, he had made a fatal, sloppy administrative error. He had picked the wrong date on the calendar. I left the kitchen once again and walked back to my study. I bypassed the filing cabinets and walked directly over to the tall wooden bookshelf nestled in the corner of the room. I reached for a thick, weather-beaten leather journal sitting on the middle shelf. It was my personal fishing log. Since Evelyn passed away, I had made it a point to take one major, completely off-the-grid fishing trip every single year, documenting every catch, every weather pattern, and every location, with the meticulous detail of an engineer. I carried the heavy leather book back to the kitchen and dropped it onto the island right next to the forged legal document. I flipped through the thick parchment pages, the smell of old paper and dried sea salt rising into the air. I bypassed the entries from the spring and early summer, my fingers tracing the margins, until I landed squarely on the middle of August. There it was, written in my own unmistakable handwriting, backed by detailed sketches and coordinate locations. On August 14th, I was not in Dallas, Texas. I was not anywhere near a lawyer office or a notary public. On the exact day this document claimed I had personally signed away the rights to my home, I was over 3,000 miles away. I was standing on the freezing wet deck of a commercial deep-sea fishing charter right off the rugged coast of Kodiak, Alaska. The memories flooded back with absolute clarity. The biting, icy wind whipping across the bow of the boat. The massive, churning gray waves crashing against the hull. I remembered the distinct smell of diesel fuel and fresh bait. I remembered wrestling with a 60-pound halibut for nearly 40 minutes. But most importantly, I remembered the isolation. We were out in open water, completely beyond the reach of any cellular towers or communication networks. I had not sent an email, made a phone call, or received a single text message for 5 entire days. I looked from the open pages of my fishing log to the fraudulent legal document. The contrast was beautiful. My son had tried to build an inescapable trap, but he had accidentally given me an ironclad, indisputable alibi. I had receipts for the plane tickets. I had the official passenger manifest from the charter company. I had credit card charges for the fishing gear rented at the marina. And I had 15 other fishermen on that boat, including the seasoned captain and his crew, who could absolutely testify under oath that I was stranded in the middle of the Alaskan Ocean, on the very day I supposedly walked into a Dallas office to sign away my estate. The power of attorney was not just slightly questionable. It was undeniably criminally fraudulent. The legal foundation of their entire scheme was built on a provable lie. I closed the leather journal, my mind racing through the mathematical probabilities of what this meant. If you find one critical structural flaw in a seemingly sound building, you must automatically assume the entire foundation is compromised. Lucas had willfully committed a severe federal crime to steal this house. He had crossed a line that most people would never even approach. If he was willing to frankly risk years in a federal penitentiary just to forge a property deed, what else had he touched? What other vital systems had he compromised while I was not looking? The chilling implications began to spread through my mind like a dark stain. The house was merely a physical asset that could be bought and sold. But my life was interconnected with dozens of other vulnerable points. If Lucas had successfully bypassed the legal safeguards to transfer a deed, he could easily bypass the security protocols on my standard finances. He knew my social security number. He knew my maiden name. He had all the answers to my security questions. I pushed the documents aside. The time for investigating the past was over. I needed to check my personal bank accounts immediately. I left the quiet solitude of my study and walked down the short hallway to the small spare room I used as a home office. It was a modest space filled with old drafting tables, rolled-up blueprints, and a sturdy, unremarkable desktop computer sitting in the corner. I sat down in my worn leather desk chair and pressed the power button on the computer tower. The machine hummed to life, the cooling fan whirring softly in the otherwise silent house. While I waited for the outdated operating system to load, I thought about the specific financial boundaries I had established with my son over the past decade. When Evelyn passed away and left me the Caldwell Trust, I made a conscious, deliberate decision to completely separate my daily life from that immense fortune. I wanted to remain the same man I had always been. I wanted to pay for my own groceries, mow my own lawn, and live within the reasonable means of a retired mechanical engineer. To maintain this careful illusion, I kept my original local bank account completely active. It was a standard public checking account holding exactly $40,000. It was the accumulated sum of my modest company pension and some conservative low-yield savings. This was the only financial account Lucas knew about. Whenever he visited, if he ever glanced at a bank statement sitting on the kitchen counter, he would see a comfortable but decidedly working-class balance. He believed that $40,000 along with the equity in this house constituted the absolute entirety of my earthly net worth. The computer screen finally brightened, casting a pale bluish glow across my face. I opened the web browser and navigated to the familiar login page of my local Texas bank. My fingers moved mechanically across the keyboard, typing in my username and my long, complex password. I clicked the button to submit my credentials. The page loaded slowly, the small spinning circle on the screen feeling like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I took a steadying breath, preparing myself for whatever new violation I was about to uncover. The dashboard materialized on the monitor. I looked directly at the bold black numbers displayed at the very top of the page under the heading of available balance, $0.00. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh light reflecting off my silver reading glasses. I blinked momentarily, thinking the bank website was experiencing some sort of technical glitch. I refreshed the page. The screen flickered, reloaded, and displayed the exact same devastating number, 0. My account had been completely drained. Every single penny I had earned from 40 years of grinding honest labor at the manufacturing plant had been wiped out. I did not feel panic over the lost funds. The money itself meant absolutely nothing to me. I had $90 million sitting securely in a private, heavily encrypted trust fund managed by top-tier financial experts. I could lose $40,000 every single day for the rest of my life and never even feel the impact. But the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the theft made my blood run cold. My son had not just forged a legal deed to steal the roof over my head. He had systematically reached into my pocket and stolen the very last dollar to my name. I moved the computer mouse and clicked on the detailed transaction history tab. I needed to see the exact mechanism of the theft. I needed to know how and when the extraction had occurred. The digital ledger populated on the screen, showing months of mundane, ordinary expenses. A grocery store bill here, a utility payment there. And then at the very top of the list, a massive glaring anomaly. An outgoing domestic wire transfer had been initiated and fully processed just yesterday afternoon. The withdrawal amount was exactly $39,985, leaving a negligible $15 fee balance that the bank had immediately absorbed. I clicked on the specific transaction to expand the routing details. The money had been wired directly to a commercial holding account located in Chicago, Illinois. I stared at the small typed text in the optional memo line attached to the wire transfer. The words were written with a sickening, calculated precision. Medical facility deposit. My hands curled into tight fists, my fingernails digging sharply into my palms. Lucas and Monica had actually used my own stolen pension money to fund their incredibly dark, fabricated narrative. They were moving my cash to make it look like they were responsibly securing my placement in a premier assisted living center. It was a masterful, deeply cynical stroke of accounting. If any local investigator or suspicious bank manager ever looked at the paper trail, they would see a loving son transferring his deteriorating father's assets to appropriately pay for his urgent necessary medical care. They had robbed me blind, and they had disguised the robbery as an act of profound filial devotion. I pushed my chair back from the desk, letting the wheels roll smoothly across the plastic floor mat. I steepled my fingers under my chin, staring into the dark corners of the room. The initial wave of raw, paternal heartbreak was entirely gone now. My engineering mind took over completely, breaking the situation down into cold, raw data points. Something about this elaborate crime did not make logical sense. I analyzed the variables. Lucas was a senior vice president at a prominent logistics firm. He earned a highly respectable six-figure salary complete with quarterly corporate bonuses and a generous benefits package. Monica had always proudly boasted about her affluent family background in Atlanta, constantly flaunting her expensive designer handbags and her supposedly vast investment portfolio. They lived in an exclusive high-rent district in the city. They drove imported luxury vehicles. They projected an image of absolute untouchable financial success. So why on earth would two supposedly wealthy, successful professionals risk severe federal wire fraud charges to steal a measly $40,000 from an old man? If they were simply greedy, they would have just taken the house. The house was worth nearly $500,000 in the current market. The house was a massive, lucrative asset, worth the considerable legal risk of a forged notary seal, but draining a basic checking account for a fraction of that amount. That was not an act of calculated corporate greed. That was an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. People who have millions of dollars do not risk 15 years in a federal penitentiary to steal 40 grand. They only take that kind of terrifying absolute risk when their backs are pushed entirely against a wall. They only commit that level of sloppy, traceable fraud when they are absolutely frantic for immediate liquid cash. The realization settled over me with a heavy, ominous weight. Lucas and Monica were not wealthy. They were completely, devastatingly broke. Their entire lavish lifestyle was a hollow, crumbling facade. They were drowning in some kind of massive, suffocating debt, and the pressure had finally broken them. The hurried house sale, the forged documents, the stolen pension money, the aggressive eviction notice. None of it was about upgrading their luxury lifestyle or building a brighter future. It was a desperate, panicked scramble to survive. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately, which meant they were terrified of something or someone. I needed to know exactly what kind of monster was chasing my son, because that was the very same monster I was going to use to destroy him. I pushed away from the computer desk and walked out of the small office, my steps purposeful and measured. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and headed down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2 in the morning. It was the perfect hour for the kind of work I was about to initiate. I walked over to the heavy oak armoire that had belonged to my grandfather. With a firm grip, I gripped the bottom edge and pushed it to the right. The heavy piece of furniture slid smoothly across the hardwood floor on hidden custom-installed casters, revealing a plain section of wooden floorboards. I knelt down and pressed my thumb against a specific, barely visible knot in the wood. A small rectangular panel popped open, exposing the biometric scanner of my hidden floor safe. I pressed my right index finger firmly against the illuminated glass. The heavy steel locking mechanism disengaged with a deep, satisfying metallic thud. I lifted the heavy door. Inside lay a few stacks of physical currency, some old family heirloom jewelry I had kept from Evelyn, and a small, heavy black case. I reached past the cash and pulled out the case, unsnapping the latches to reveal a sleek satellite-encrypted phone. It was a piece of hardware typically reserved for high-level corporate executives operating in hostile foreign territories. I had purchased it specifically for managing the Caldwell Trust, ensuring that absolutely none of my massive financial transactions ever crossed paths with my vulnerable public local networks. I carried the encrypted phone back to the living room and sat down in my favorite leather recliner. I powered on the device, watching the small screen illuminate the dark room with a harsh white light. I bypassed the standard dialing menu and entered a complex sequence of numbers from memory. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Mr. Caldwell," the voice said. It was Sylvia Vargas. Sylvia was the senior wealth manager of the Caldwell Trust, a brilliant, absolutely ruthless financial strategist who managed my $90 million portfolio with an iron fist. She was one of the very few people on this earth who knew the actual scale of my resources. "It is quite late in Texas," she continued. "I trust this is not a social call." "Sylvia," I replied, allowing my voice to drop to its natural authoritative register. The frail, confused old man who had spoken to Lucas just an hour ago was entirely gone. "I need you to initiate a total, scorched earth financial audit, and I need it done immediately." I heard the subtle shift in her breathing over the line. The pleasantries vanished instantly. "Give me the targets," she said. "Lucas Caldwell and Monica Caldwell." I instructed, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction as I officially targeted my own son. "I want you to deploy your elite forensic accounting team right now. I need them to dig into every single aspect of their financial lives. I want every credit card statement, every wire transfer, every mortgage document, and every tax return from the last 5 years. I need to know exactly who they owe money to, how much they owe, and what kind of collateral is on the line. They are absolutely desperate for cash, Sylvia. They just committed a massive federal wire fraud to steal $40,000 from my public pension account, and they used a forged power of attorney to illegally sell my primary residence." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the encrypted connection. "Your son forged a property deed to steal your home?" Sylvia asked, her voice laced with professional outrage. "Harrison, that is a severe federal offense. I can have my legal team file an injunction by dawn to freeze the sale. I can have the local authorities at his front door before he even finishes his morning coffee." "No," I commanded sharply. "Do not touch the property sale. Do not alert the authorities. If you block the sale right now, they will simply panic and scatter, and I will never find out who is pulling their strings. I want them to believe they have won. I want them to feel completely, utterly secure in their success. Do not freeze any accounts, and do not trigger any automated banking alerts. This entire audit must be strictly covert. They cannot know anyone is looking into their books. I need the raw data, Sylvia. I need to understand the exact anatomy of their desperation." "Understood," she replied smoothly, immediately adjusting to my strategic parameters. "My team will utilize ghost protocols. We will trace their digital footprint without leaving any digital fingerprints of our own." "What is our operational timeline?" "You have exactly 24 hours, I said, staring at the face of the grandfather clock across the room. They gave me a 72-hour eviction notice, which means they are operating on a brutally tight deadline. The moving trucks arrive on Monday morning. I need the complete financial dossier by tomorrow night. I need to know exactly what kind of monster is chasing them, because I fully intend to feed them directly to it. I will have the preliminary data package sent to your encrypted server by tomorrow evening," Sylvia confirmed. "Is there anything else you need?" "Harrison, physical security, a secure relocation team." "No," I replied calmly. "I am perfectly safe. Just get me the data." I ended the call and placed the heavy satellite phone down onto the glass coffee table. I leaned back into the leather upholstery and took a slow, deep breath, feeling the adrenaline pumping steadily through my veins. The trap was now officially set. The financial bloodhounds were off their leashes, silently tracking my son's every digital move. But while Sylvia and her team waged a quiet, invisible war in the digital realm, I still had a physical performance to maintain in the real world. I looked toward the large bay window at the front of the living room. The curtains were drawn, but I knew the reality of living in a tight-knit suburban neighborhood. People talk. Neighbors watch. If Lucas had dispatched anyone to drive by and check on my progress, or if nosy neighbors were simply peeking through their blinds, I needed to look the part of a defeated, compliant victim. I pushed myself up from the recliner and walked out to the attached garage. I found a stack of flattened, heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes stacked near the lawnmower. I grabbed half a dozen of them along with a roll of clear packing tape and carried them back inside the house. I dropped the supplies in the center of the living room floor. The loud, harsh ripping sound of the packing tape echoed loudly as I quickly assembled the first box. I folded the bottom flaps, taped them securely, and set the empty box near the front window, intentionally placing it where it would be clearly visible from the street. I was meticulously setting the stage for a devastating war. Lucas was about to learn the true cost of betrayal. I taped the final cardboard box shut and pushed it against the wall, perfectly completing the visual illusion for anyone peeking through the front window. It was time to initiate the next phase of my strategy. To dismantle their operation from the inside out, I needed a direct line into their private world. I walked into my bedroom and opened my nightstand drawer. Hidden beneath a stack of old reading glasses were two miniature audio recorders. I had purchased them years ago to secretly dictate engineering notes while crawling through tight industrial spaces. They were incredibly small, highly sensitive, and capable of recording continuously for 96 hours. I slipped both devices into my left jacket pocket. Next, I went to the hall closet and pulled down a small, heavy wooden chest containing Evelyn's most cherished antique photo albums. I wiped the dust from the lid and carried it to the kitchen counter. I picked up my phone and dialed Monica's number. I cleared my throat, forcing my vocal cords to tighten artificially, injecting a rough, wet tremor into my voice. She answered on the fourth ring. Her tone was sharp and impatient. I took a shallow, shaky breath and spoke. "Monica," I said, allowing my voice to break pitifully. "It is Harrison. I am so sorry to bother you." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "What is it, Harrison?" she asked, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "We are very busy handling your transition." "I know," I whispered, sounding thoroughly defeated. "I am packing my things just like Lucas asked. But I found Evelyn's old photo albums. The facility only allows me to bring 2 small suitcases. I cannot bear to throw her memories into the trash. Could I please bring the box over to your place just to keep them safe? I promise I will not stay long." I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She wanted me out of her life, but denying a weeping old man his dead wife's photo albums was a bad look even for her. Besides, allowing me to drop them off fed perfectly into her narrative of victory. She was the generous caretaker indulging my final pathetic requests. "Fine," she snapped. "But make it quick. Lucas is not home and I have a dozen calls to make." I thanked her profusely, laying the gratitude on thick, and ended the connection. I carried the heavy wooden box out to my truck and drove across town to their upscale neighborhood. They lived in a sprawling modern penthouse in one of the most expensive high-rise buildings in the city. As I pulled into the polished circular driveway and handed my keys to the uniformed valet, my mind recalled the stolen $40,000. This entire extravagant lifestyle was a desperate, hollow illusion, funded by deceit and theft. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, my heart steady and my hands perfectly still. I stepped off into the private foyer and knocked timidly on their massive double doors. Monica opened the door wearing a silk designer robe, a sleek tablet clutched tightly in her manicured hand. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing with pure, unfiltered disgust. She did not see a retired engineer. She saw a pathetic, obsolete burden. "Come in," she commanded, stepping aside without offering to help me carry the heavy box. "Just put it somewhere out of the way. Do not scuff the hardwood." I shuffled forward, intentionally rounding my shoulders and shortening my stride to mimic a frail, disoriented old man. I clutched the heavy wooden chest awkwardly to my chest, letting my hands tremble just enough to sell the performance. As I crossed the massive sunlit living room, I purposely dragged my left boot, catching the edge of an expensive Persian rug. I stumbled forward, letting out a sharp gasp, and allowed the heavy box to slip from my grip. It crashed loudly onto the floor. Several thick leather photo albums spilled out, sliding across the polished wood. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Monica hissed, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling in sheer exasperation. "Harrison, watch what you are doing." "I am so sorry, Monica," I stammered, dropping to my knees with a practiced, pathetic clumsiness. "My hands just are not working right today. I am just so confused by everything." I began to slowly, shakily gather the scattered albums. Monica stood over me, making absolutely no effort to assist. Her expression was a portrait of pure contempt. She opened her mouth to scold me further, but her tablet suddenly began to ring loudly. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening slightly. It was clearly a call she had been anxiously waiting for. "Just clean up this mess and leave the box in the corner," she snapped, turning her back on me without a second thought. "I have to take this call. Do not touch anything else." She walked swiftly away, pacing nervously toward the far end of the open-concept kitchen, already raising her voice to whoever was on the other end of the line. This was my exact window of opportunity. The moment her back was completely turned, the frail, trembling old man vanished instantly. I moved with the swift, silent precision of a mechanic. I reached into my left jacket pocket and pulled out the first miniature audio recorder. I slid silently across the floor toward their massive custom-designed sectional sofa. I reached underneath the heavy fabric, feeling for a solid wooden crossbeam. I pressed the adhesive backing of the small device firmly against the hidden wood, securing it perfectly near the center of the room. It would pick up every single conversation held in that living space. I quietly gathered the remaining photo albums, placed them neatly back into the wooden chest, and pushed the box securely against the wall. Monica was still pacing in the kitchen, her back to me, arguing intensely about a delayed wire transfer. I stood up smoothly and walked quietly down the wide hallway toward the master suite. I knew the layout of this penthouse. Lucas maintained a private, soundproofed home office just off the main bedroom. If they were discussing their massive debts or orchestrating further illegal activities, they would absolutely do it behind those closed doors. I slipped silently into the office. The room was immaculate, dominated by a massive glass desk and 3 computer monitors. I did not waste time looking through his drawers. I needed a listening post that would never be casually discovered. I stepped into the small private bathroom attached directly to the office. I pulled the second audio recorder from my pocket and reached around the back of the porcelain toilet tank. I pressed the adhesive strip firmly against the cool, hidden ceramic surface, completely out of the direct line of sight. I slipped back down the wide hallway, perfectly timing my return to the living room as Monica ended her call. Dropping my shoulders, I resumed my hunched, defeated posture near the door. The Trojan horse was inside. I smiled. My covert war had officially just begun. I walked out of the opulent penthouse building and handed the valet my ticket, carefully maintaining the slow, unsteady gait of a broken man until I was securely inside the cab of my truck. The moment the heavy door shut, sealing me inside the soundproofed interior, the stooped posture vanished. I sat up straight, gripping the leather steering wheel with firm, steady hands. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of passing streetlights and shifting shadows. I pulled into my driveway and walked through the front door of my quiet, empty house. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, a deep, resonant sound that perfectly matched the calculated rhythm of my racing heart. I walked past the staged cardboard moving boxes in the living room and headed directly for my private study. I sat down in the leather chair, leaving the main overhead lights off. The only illumination came from the small brass desk lamp. I unlocked the hidden floor safe, retrieved the heavy black case, and pulled out the satellite-encrypted phone. I placed it squarely in the center of the wooden desk and waited in the silent darkness. At exactly 2 a.m, the device vibrated with a single sharp tone. The screen glowed bright white, displaying a notification of an incoming encrypted data package from Sylvia Vargas. I typed in my complex alphanumeric decryption key and watched as the progress bar rapidly filled the screen. Sylvia and her elite forensic accounting team had ruthlessly executed my directive. They had operated with surgical precision, ripping away the glossy, sophisticated veneer of his entire life to expose the rotting foundation underneath. I connected the satellite phone to my secure desktop computer and opened the massive digital dossier. The files populated instantly across my large monitor. I began to sift through the organized folders, opening bank statements, intercepted credit reports, hidden mortgage documents, and complex tax returns. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial total destruction. The spreadsheet cells were bleeding a vibrant, aggressive red. I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the desk, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their complete financial ruin. I expected to find a few overdrawn credit cards or perhaps an underwater secondary mortgage. What Sylvia had uncovered was a financial crater so incredibly massive, it defied basic logic. I opened a subfolder specifically dedicated to Monica Caldwell. For years, she had proudly paraded around our family gatherings, loudly boasting about her prestigious career as an independent corporate strategy consultant. She had seamlessly projected the image of a highly sought-after executive flying first class to private meetings and dining with venture capitalists. The reality plainly displayed in the forensic audit was shockingly pathetic. Monica was not a consultant. Her business registration was nothing more than a hollow shell company, an empty corporate entity used exclusively to mask her actual daily activities. She was a day trader, and she was an incredibly reckless, wildly incompetent one. She had spent the last 4 years sitting in her luxurious penthouse, gambling massive amounts of borrowed money on highly volatile, over-leveraged commercial real estate margins. She had started small, using his corporate bonuses to cover early losses, but the aggressive trading had quickly spiraled into a catastrophic addiction. She had completely drained their joint savings accounts. She had quietly liquidated their retirement portfolios. She had taken out aggressive secondary loans against their imported luxury vehicles. But the most devastating document was a consolidated balance sheet Sylvia had compiled at the very bottom of the file. Her wildly speculative real estate plays had completely imploded during a recent market correction. She was currently holding a negative balance of exactly $2.5 million. $2.5 million. The number stared back at me from the glowing monitor, a testament to pure, unadulterated arrogance. The stolen $40,000 from my pension account was nothing but a desperate drop in a massive bottomless bucket. It was just enough liquid cash to pay a fraudulent corporate lawyer and temporarily silence a collections agent. But the true horror of their situation was not the staggering amount of the debt itself. It was the specific identity of their primary creditor. I clicked on a heavily encrypted file labeled Priority Threat Assessment. The team had meticulously traced the complex origin of the massive high-interest loans Monica had secured to cover her initial margin calls. She had not borrowed this money from a reputable national bank. Traditional financial institutions have strict regulatory limits and required collateral. Monica had completely bypassed the legal banking sector. She had foolishly taken a massive unsecured loan from a shadowy, highly dangerous private lending syndicate operating out of an industrial sector in Chicago. These were not men who sent polite printed collection notices through the mail. They were ruthless, unregulated underground operators who charged predatory astronomical interest rates and utilized extreme violent intimidation to ensure absolute compliance. I read through the intercepted communication logs Sylvia had managed to extract from his private email server. The messages from the Chicago syndicate were chillingly brief and completely devoid of standard corporate pleasantries. The final message, delivered just 4 days ago, was a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum. They had given Lucas and Monica exactly 10 days to produce the initial sum of $1 million. If they completely failed to meet this aggressive deadline, the syndicate explicitly promised severe, unavoidable physical consequences. They heavily implied that Lucas would lose far more than just his corporate job or his luxury penthouse. The terrifying reality of their situation suddenly clicked into place with perfect, terrifying clarity. The sudden, aggressive 72-hour eviction notice, the meticulously forged property deed, the stolen $40,000 from my pension fund. None of this was simply about pure greed. It was a panicked, frantic scramble for absolute survival. Lucas had realized he was 10 days away from having his legs broken by Chicago enforcers, and his immediate instinctual solution was to ruthlessly sacrifice his own father to the wolves. He intended to rapidly liquidate my house, steal the equity, and use my entire life savings to literally buy his own life back. I leaned back into the heavy leather chair, feeling a cold, dark wave of absolute power wash over my entire body. They were actively bleeding out, deeply terrified of a predator they could not control. They thought they were ruthlessly playing me, completely unaware that I was a man with a hidden $90 million fortune. I possessed the massive financial resources to either instantly solve their terrifying problem or systematically ensure their total, absolute destruction. I sat in the silent, dark study watching the glowing computer monitor, perfectly content to let the invisible, tightening noose slowly choke the remaining life out of their arrogant, hollow existence. The digital files illuminated the grim, undeniable truth of their hidden nightmare. Tomorrow I would carefully listen to the secret audio recordings from their apartment. I would patiently hear their panic echo through the hidden microphones. They had foolishly invited the ultimate architect of their complete ruin directly into their home, ensuring their inevitable downfall and entirely sealing their miserable fate. I awoke the next morning long before the sun crested the horizon. The grandfather clock in the hallway was just striking 5 when I poured my first cup of black coffee and carried it down the narrow hall to my private study. The house was completely silent, wrapped in the heavy stillness of early dawn, but my mind was already racing with the cold, calculated precision of an engineer approaching a critical stress test. I sat down at my desk and opened the heavy black case containing the receiver for the miniature audio recorders I had planted in their penthouse the day before. I plugged a pair of high-quality noise-canceling headphones into the audio jack. I slipped them over my ears, adjusting the padded cups, until the ambient sounds of my own house faded into absolute nothingness. I reached out and twisted the small frequency dial on the receiver, tuning the signal to the specific channel assigned to the recorder hidden behind the toilet tank in Lucas's home office. At first, there was only the faint, rhythmic hiss of static, a hollow white noise that filled my ears. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the audio feed, waiting with the infinite patience of a predator in the tall grass. A few minutes later, the static was suddenly pierced by the sharp, heavy sound of a door slamming shut. I leaned forward in my leather chair, pressing the headphones tighter against my head. The audio was remarkably clear, picking up the distinct, frantic sound of heavy leather shoes pacing aggressively across the polished hardwood floor. I could picture my son perfectly in that immaculate glass-walled office pacing back and forth like a trapped animal. The rapid, uneven rhythm of his footsteps broadcasted a level of pure, unadulterated panic that he had completely managed to hide during our phone call. He was terrified. Then I heard the distinct sound of ice clinking against the side of a heavy crystal glass, followed by the sound of liquid splashing quickly. He was pouring a drink, likely a stiff pour of whiskey, seeking chemical courage at an hour when most people were just starting their morning coffee. The pacing continued, growing faster, more erratic until the heavy office door swung open again. "Have you lost your mind?" a voice snapped. It was Monica. Her tone was completely devoid of the artificial, sickly sweet concern she used in public. It was sharp, venomous, and dripping with raw contempt. "It is barely 6 in the morning, and you are pacing a hole into the floorboards while drinking scotch. You need to pull yourself together before you ruin everything." "I am ruining everything," Lucas shouted back, his voice cracking with a high, desperate pitch I had never heard from him before. "Are you actually hearing the words coming out of your mouth, Monica? I just committed a major federal felony. I just forged my own father's signature on a highly regulated legal document. I sold his primary residence right out from under him. Do you understand the sheer magnitude of what we have done? We did not just borrow money from a friend. We committed massive, undeniable real estate fraud. I closed my eyes, letting his full, uncoerced confession wash over me. The satisfaction of hearing him admit his crime was profound, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sheer desperation in his voice. "Keep your voice down," Monica hissed, her words cutting through the air like a serrated blade. "Do you want the entire building to hear you? The deed is done, Lucas. The paperwork was accepted. The eviction notice was served, and your father bought the entire story. He is currently packing his things into cheap cardboard boxes, completely convinced his mind is rapidly failing him. We have the absolute upper hand. You need to stop acting like a frightened child and start acting like a man who wants to survive the week." "Survive!" Lucas fired back, the clinking of his glass, indicating his hands were visibly shaking. "We are drowning, Monica. I just stole my own father's entire public pension. I wired $40,000 out of his personal retirement account yesterday afternoon just to pay the monthly interest on your massive leveraged debt. I wiped out his entire life savings, the money he worked 40 grueling years at the manufacturing plant to secure just to buy us a few extra days of breathing room. We are crossing the line, Monica. We are completely out of control. This is not just aggressive corporate accounting anymore. This is severe, highly punishable criminal behavior. If anyone looks closely at those transfer logs, if anyone contests that fraudulent power of attorney will be the one wearing a federal prison uniform for the next 20 years. Everything has my name on it." I sat perfectly still in my dark study, the black coffee growing cold in the mug beside me. The raw audio feed was confirming every single piece of data Sylvia's forensic accounting team had meticulously unearthed. Lucas was fully aware of the legal peril he was in. He knew the absolute horror of his actions. He was fully cognizant of the fact that he was actively destroying his own father's life to save his own skin. And yet the driving force behind his panic was not genuine moral remorse. It was not a sudden, painful realization of his failure as a son. It was simply the paralyzing, suffocating fear of getting caught. He was grieving his own potential loss of freedom, not the loss of his father's dignity. For a moment, the hidden microphone picked up only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. I waited for Monica to offer some form of comfort, some empty reassurance to calm her spiraling husband. Instead, her response was so profoundly cold, so devoid of basic human empathy, that it chilled the blood in my veins. "You listened to me very carefully, Lucas," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that commanded absolute attention. "You can stand there and cry about your father's miserable $40,000 pension all you want. You can feel guilty about a house he is too old to maintain anyway. But you seem to be conveniently forgetting exactly who we are dealing with." The pacing stopped entirely. The silence in the office was suddenly heavy and suffocating. "We are currently holding $2.5 million in debt," she continued, ruthlessly hammering the reality of their situation into his mind. "And we do not owe that money to a forgiving national bank. We do not owe it to a friendly venture capital firm that will simply restructure our repayment terms over a pleasant corporate lunch. We owe that money to a highly organized, completely unregulated private syndicate operating out of Chicago. Do you understand what that means? They do not care about your guilt. They do not care about your father. They care about their money." I heard the sound of her expensive heels clicking slowly against the floor as she stepped closer to him. "They gave us exactly 10 days, Lucas." She whispered, her words laced with pure, unfiltered terror. 10 days to produce a liquid payment of $1 million, or they explicitly promised to send men to this very apartment to physically dismantle us. They will not send collection letters. They will break our legs, Lucas. They will shatter our knees, and they will take absolutely everything we own. So you can either wipe your tears, finalize the sale of your father's house by Monday morning, and hand them their cash, or you can prepare for a visit from men who will not hesitate to put you in a wheelchair for the rest of your natural life. The audio feed went dead silent, save for the faint, steady sound of Lucas's terrified breathing. He was completely trapped, pinned between the threat of a long federal prison sentence and the immediate violent promise of a ruthless criminal syndicate. The entire conflict had instantaneously shifted. This was no longer a simple story of a greedy son stealing a suburban house from a naive, aging father. This was a desperate life-or-death struggle for survival in a dangerous, unforgiving, criminal underworld. I slowly reached up and removed the heavy headphones, placing them gently onto the wooden desk. I leaned back into my chair, letting the sheer magnitude of their predicament wash over me. My son had sold his soul to buy an illusion of wealth, and the devil had finally come to collect. They were absolutely terrified, scrambling frantically to beat a Monday deadline set by violent, dangerous men. They needed the equity from my home to literally buy their physical safety. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. They needed my house to survive. They needed my complete compliance to save their legs. They were depending on the quiet, pathetic surrender of a confused old man. I picked up my coffee mug and took a long, slow sip. The bitter, dark liquid grounded me perfectly in the moment. The trap was set, the timeline was established, and I held the absolute power to let the syndicate tear them apart, piece by piece. I sat perfectly still in the dimly lit study, the heavy leather headphones pressing firmly against my ears. The initial shock of discovering their massive debt to the Chicago syndicate had temporarily numbed my senses, but the audio feed from their penthouse was far from over. I reached out and rested my hand against the cold ceramic surface of my coffee mug, needing a physical anchor to keep myself grounded in reality. Through the static-free connection, the acoustic landscape of their luxurious living room painted a vivid picture in my mind. The rapid, frantic pacing of my son had momentarily ceased. The heavy silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension, a brief pause in a conversation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. I took a slow, measured breath, waiting for the next inevitable fracture in their crumbling facade. Lucas was the first to break the quiet. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of all its usual corporate confidence. "Okay," Lucas said, his tone wavering with a sickening blend of fear and exhaustion. "Okay, we have the house equity coming. We have the $40,000 from his pension account. We can pay the syndicate their initial $1 million by Friday. But what about the rest of it, Monica? What about my father?" The lawyer gave him 72 hours. "The movers are scheduled for Monday morning. We still have to pay for his medical transition. Those premier assisted living facilities demand massive deposits up front, and we just diverted his entire pension to cover your margin interest. How are we supposed to pay for his care package now?" I pressed the headphones closer, my entire body tensing, in anticipation of her answer. I fully expected Monica to suggest taking out another fraudulent loan, or perhaps liquidating whatever small assets they had left to cover my entry into some modest state-run nursing home. What I heard instead was a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my natural life. Monica laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a bitter chuckle born of their desperate circumstances. It was a cold, sharp, genuinely amused sound that echoed brightly across their expensive hardwood floors. It was the laugh of a predator admiring its own trap. "A premier assisted living facility," Monica repeated, her voice dripping with profound, unfiltered mockery. "Are you honestly still clinging to that ridiculous script, Lucas? That was the story we fed to your father to keep him compliant. That was the medical narrative we gave to Bradley Thorne so the lawyer would feel comfortable drafting the eviction notice. Do you actually think I would waste a single dime of our remaining capital on a luxury retirement suite for that old man? Then where is he going?" Lucas demanded, his voice rising in sudden panic. "Monica, the movers are bringing a transport vehicle on Monday. We told him he was going to a care facility. Where did you tell the transport drivers to take him?" "I found a place," Monica stated calmly, the sheer casualness of her tone striking me like a physical blow. "It is not a premier facility, Lucas. It is not even a registered medical clinic. It is an unlicensed off-the-grid hospice compound located about 10 miles north of the Mexican border. I wired a non-refundable deposit of exactly $2,000 to the property manager through an encrypted offshore account. That leaves us with $38,000 from his pension to pay the Chicago syndicate. Your father is not going to a luxury resort, Lucas. He is going to a warehouse. A warehouse, Lucas stammered, the horror finally bleeding into his voice. Monica, what are you talking about? He needs daily meals. He needs basic supervision. If the authorities check on him, if anyone from the state investigates his living conditions, they will trace it right back to us. You cannot just abandon him in an unlicensed building. Nobody is going to check on him. Lucas, Monica replied, her voice dropping into a chilling deadpan register. It is a black hole. There are no registered doctors on staff. There is absolutely no state oversight. There are no official visitor logs or medical records. The people who run this place cater specifically to families who need their elderly relatives to quietly disappear without generating a tedious legal footprint. They take the patients in, they lock the doors, and they aggressively over-medicate them to keep them quiet and compliant. They keep them heavily sedated 24 hours a day. I stopped breathing. The air in my study suddenly felt as thick and heavy as water. I stared blindly at the glowing computer screen, my mind struggling to process the absolute, unadulterated evil radiating through the headphones. They were not just stealing my money. They were not just taking my house. They were intentionally sending me to a slow, silent execution. At his age, Monica continued smoothly, entirely unfazed by the monstrous nature of her own words, with the sudden physical stress of the eviction and the heavy chemical sedation. His heart will give out in less than a month. Probably much sooner. It is a biological certainty. And when it happens, the facility will quietly dispose of the remains. There will be no formal autopsy. There will be no official police investigation. Nobody will ask any questions, Lucas. The problem will simply solve itself, and we will be completely free to liquidate the rest of his estate to pay off the Chicago lenders. The audio feed hissed softly in my ears. I waited for my son to scream. I waited for Lucas to violently reject this horrific conspiracy, to draw a final moral line, and tell his wife that he would absolutely not be an active accomplice to his own father's premeditated murder. A month, Lucas whispered. His voice was completely devoid of anger. There was no outrage. There was only a quiet, sickening resignation. Are you absolutely sure there is no paper trail? Are you sure the transport drivers will not talk? The drivers are private contractors, Monica assured him coldly. They are paid in untraceable cash to transport cargo, not to ask questions. Your father will get in the car on Monday morning, and that will be the very last time we ever have to deal with him. I reached up with trembling hands and pulled the headphones off my head, dropping them heavily onto the wooden desk. The mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed deafening now, a relentless countdown to a scheduled execution. The conflict had entirely shifted its shape. I was no longer a retired engineer fighting a fraudulent property deed. I was a man actively fighting for my very survival against two ruthless predators who viewed my death as a convenient financial transaction. They had removed every boundary of human decency. I stood up from my chair, my heart cold, and my resolve completely hardened into impenetrable steel. I looked closely at the black monitor, watching my own reflection stare back at me with cold eyes that no longer recognized the concept of mercy. The time for gathering quiet evidence was officially over. As my hand moved toward the heavy black receiver to sever the connection, a sharp, sudden crackle of static echoed from the padded headphones resting on the mahogany desk. I paused, my fingers hovering just inches above the smooth power dial. The ambient hiss of their luxurious living room had changed, replaced by a tense, heavy silence that signaled the conversation was not entirely finished. Driven by a morbid, masochistic need to hear the absolute bottom of their depravity, I slowly picked up the headset and pulled it back over my ears. Lucas was speaking again, his voice much lower now, stripped of its previous frantic energy and replaced by a hollow, trembling uncertainty. He was pacing slowly near the massive glass window of his office, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. Monica, He whispered the sound barely registering on the highly sensitive hidden microphone. We do not have to go this far. We can just take the equity from the house sale. The property will easily clear enough cash to pay the Chicago syndicate their initial $1 million by Friday afternoon. We can give them exactly what they demand right now, and we can find a standard basic care facility for my father. A state-run place. Somewhere cheap, but somewhere relatively safe. We absolutely do not need to send him to a border compound to die in a dark room. The silence that followed his desperate plea was thick, heavy, and completely suffocating. I could hear the faint clinking of ice against crystal as Monica stepped closer to him. You are incredibly naive, Lucas, she said, her tone entirely devoid of any marital affection or basic human warmth. You are staring directly at a burning building and trying to calculate the cost of a fire extinguisher. The $1 million we are paying the syndicate on Monday morning is merely a good faith deposit to stop them from breaking our legs. It temporarily buys us time, but it absolutely does not buy our permanent freedom. We still owe them another $1.5 million in principal plus a weekly VIG that is compounding at a highly predatory, violent rate. The house equity barely covers the initial blood money. Once the bank takes its cut and the remaining local creditors take theirs, we will be left with absolutely nothing. We will lose this expensive penthouse. We will lose the imported cars. We will be completely ruined. Lucas let out a pathetic, stifled sob that echoed sharply across the audio feed. But sending him down there, he stammered, his voice breaking, knowing exactly what they do, knowing how they deliberately over-medicate them until their hearts stop beating. Monica, that is not just financial fraud. If anyone ever investigates, if any authority looks closely, that is a homicide charge. I cannot have that immense weight on my conscience. I cannot just sit here in this apartment and wait for a phone call telling me my own father is dead. You will not just be waiting for a phone call, Monica replied smoothly, her voice gliding over the encrypted audio feed with the chilling, detached calmness of a venomous snake. You will be waiting for a very specific, highly lucrative financial payout. I held my breath, gripping the solid edge of my wooden desk, as her poisonous words hung heavily in the air. What are you talking about? Lucas asked, his voice shaking with fresh, terrible confusion. 6 months ago, when I first realized my commercial real estate margins were completely collapsing, I knew we needed a catastrophic contingency plan, Monica explained, her tone dripping with dark, calculated pride. I covertly contacted a private broker who specializes in extremely high-risk underwriting. I used the forged power of attorney, along with a heavily doctored, completely fabricated set of medical evaluations, to take out a comprehensive life insurance policy on your father. Lucas gasped, a sharp, sudden intake of air that rattled the sensitive microphone. A life insurance policy, he whispered in disbelief. For how much money? $5 million, Monica stated, the massive number ringing out with absolute devastating clarity. It is a massive ironclad policy, but it has a very specific, stringent stipulation regarding his advanced age and his supposed pre-existing conditions. If he passes away naturally in a care facility, the payout is fully expedited and completely unquestioned. That is exactly why we are not sending him to a standard state-run home where legitimate doctors might ask inconvenient questions or attempt to prolong his life. That is exactly why I found the underground border hospice. It provides a guaranteed, entirely untraceable outcome. Within a month, his fragile heart will naturally fail from the intense chemical stress. The facility will quietly issue a standard, unremarkable death certificate. We simply submit the final paperwork. The insurance company wires $5 million directly into our offshore holding account, and we instantly wipe out the Chicago syndicate forever. We pay off the remaining $2.5 million, and we keep the other half to quietly rebuild our entire luxury portfolio. The sheer monumental scale of her malice hit me with the physical force of a speeding freight train. They were not merely stealing the modest roof over my aging head. They were not simply abandoning an old man to save themselves from a catastrophically bad financial bet. They had actively, meticulously orchestrated my premeditated assassination for pure, unadulterated profit. They were treating my impending murder as a brilliant corporate bailout strategy. Monica had coldly priced the remainder of my life at exactly $5 million, and she was flawlessly executing the deadly transaction with the casual, sociopathic efficiency of a routine stock trade. I sat frozen, waiting for my only son to finally break. I waited for the boy I had lovingly raised to finally shatter this demonic illusion, to violently strike down the absolute monster standing in his office and violently refuse to be a willing party to brutal patricide. I listened closely to his ragged breathing, absorbing the sickening sound of his moral compass permanently fracturing under the crushing, terrifying weight of his own pathetic cowardice. 5 million. Lucas repeated slowly, the initial horror in his trembling voice slowly morphing into a sick, twisted realization of ultimate salvation. That massive amount would clear absolutely everything. It would completely clear the violent syndicate, the underwater mortgages, the maxed-out credit lines. Everything. Yes, Monica purred softly. It completely clears the board. But only if you hold your nerve, Lucas. Only if you put him in that dark transport van on Monday morning and never ever look back. There was a long, agonizing pause. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a universe I barely believed in anymore for my son to make the right choice. Finally, Lucas spoke. His voice was no longer trembling. The panic was entirely gone, replaced by a dead, hollow compliance. "Okay," he whispered. "We send him to the border." I reached up and pulled the headphones off. Any lingering paternal love I possessed was instantly completely eradicated. The emotional death of my fatherhood was absolute. I was no victim. The gloves were officially off. I placed the headphones onto the desk and sat in the silence of my study. The shadows seemed to stretch, mirroring the grotesque distortion of my reality. My son and his wife were not just thieves. They were actively plotting to murder me for a $5 million insurance payout. They intended to ship me to a border facility to be chemically executed to save themselves from a criminal syndicate. A normal man would have dialed the police. A normal father would have called the authorities, handed over the encrypted audio files, and let the justice system arrest Lucas and Monica for conspiracy to commit murder. But I was no longer a normal father. The legal system would arrest them, but it would tie the situation up in years of tedious litigation. They would hire defense attorneys, plead for mercy, and paint themselves as victims. I absolutely refused to allow them that luxury. Going to the police was far too easy. It was far too sterile. They decided to treat my life as a simple financial transaction. I decided I would return the exact same favor. I reached across the desk and picked up the satellite-encrypted phone. I powered the device on and dialed Sylvia Vargas. The line connected immediately, bypassing standard international routing protocols. Harrison Sylvia answered, her voice crisp despite the extreme hour. "I have my team analyzing the remainder of the commercial real estate data. The crater is actually expanding. The deeper we dig into Monica's margin accounts, the worse the leverage appears." "I do not care about the leverage anymore, Sylvia," I said, my voice resonating with a terrifying absolute calm. "The situation has fundamentally escalated. I just intercepted a private audio feed from their penthouse. They took out a $5 million life insurance policy on me using my forged signature. They plan to force me into an unlicensed medical facility near the southern border on Monday morning. They intend to have me sedated until my heart fails solely to collect the insurance money and pay the Chicago syndicate." There was a long, heavy silence on the encrypted line. When Sylvia finally spoke, the professional detachment was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. "Harrison, we are contacting the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I have a direct contact in the regional directorate. We will have them in federal custody before sunrise." "No," I commanded. "Do not contact the authorities. I want to handle this my own way." "I need you to pivot your entire forensic accounting team," I instructed. Stop looking at Monica's broken real estate portfolio and focus entirely on the Chicago syndicate. You told me earlier that they hold $2.5 million in debt. I need your intermediaries to make contact with the people holding that specific paper. Sylvia hesitated for a fraction of a second. Harrison, those are incredibly dangerous people. They operate completely outside the boundaries of international banking laws. They are violent loan sharks. I am well aware of who they are, I replied smoothly. And because they operate outside the law, they are driven entirely by immediate liquid cash. They do not care about collecting weekly interest from a desperate executive if they can get their principal returned in full. I want you to authorize a direct transfer from the primary accounts of the Caldwell Trust. You are going to use my money to buy Lucas and Monica's debt. You want to pay off their loan? Sylvia asked, genuine confusion bleeding into her voice. Why on earth would you save them? I am not saving them, Sylvia. I am purchasing them. I want you to buy the debt, but you must legally acquire the promissory notes. Transfer the entire $2.5 million obligation away from the Chicago syndicate and assign it directly to a private holding corporation that I completely control. I want the syndicate to get their cash, and I want them to legally sign over every single ounce of leverage they hold over my son. Sylvia let out a slow, understanding breath. You want to become their executioner, she murmured. I want to own the axe that is currently swinging over their necks, I corrected her. How fast can your intermediaries move the funds and secure the paper? For a lump sum cash buyout of that magnitude, the syndicate will move instantly, she confirmed, returning to her usual ruthless efficiency. I will route the funds through 3 separate shell corporations to ensure the origin remains entirely anonymous. The Chicago lenders will simply think a larger, aggressive, predatory group bought out their local interest. I will have the digital contracts drafted and the funds wired within the hour. Do it, I said, and terminated the connection. I sat in the dark watching the digital clock on my computer monitor tick forward. The minutes dragged by with an agonizing heavy weight. I pictured the men in Chicago waking up to a notification that their $2.5 million problem had been miraculously solved by an anonymous corporate buyer. I pictured the digital signatures being applied the heavy burden of my son's desperate debt, shifting from an uncontrollable criminal enterprise directly into the palm of my hand. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the dark liquid matching the absolute blackness that had consumed my paternal heart. The sun began to rise outside my window. The neighborhood was waking up, completely unaware of the invisible power dynamics shifting behind my blinds. I did not feel tired. The adrenaline of the ultimate betrayal had completely rewired my nervous system. I remembered the sick, relieved tone in my son's voice when he agreed to my murder. He believed he was a master manipulator who had successfully navigated a terrifying crisis by discarding his aging father. 2 hours later, the satellite phone vibrated on my desk. I answered it immediately. It is done, Sylvia stated. Her voice held a dark satisfaction. The wire transfer was completely successful. The Chicago syndicate accepted the buyout without a single question. They have officially signed over the physical promissory notes and all associated digital leverage to our anonymous holding company. They are completely out of the picture. Lucas and Monica no longer owe any money to the criminal underworld. They owe exactly $2.5 million directly to you. They are required to produce the initial $1 million payment on Monday morning, or the holding company has the absolute legal right to initiate immediate catastrophic asset seizure. I thanked Sylvia and set the phone down. The transition was absolute. I was no longer the confused, vulnerable old man packing his belongings into cardboard boxes. I was no longer the victim of an aggressive, ungrateful child. I was the architect of their total destruction. I possessed the absolute legal and financial authority to crush them. They were planning to steal my home and end my life on Monday morning. I smiled at the glowing monitor. I was going to let them walk right through my front door entirely confident in their sick, twisted victory, and then I was going to drop the executioner's axe directly onto their arrogant heads, The morning of the 72nd hour arrived with a clear sunrise that painted the sky in brilliant strokes. I stood by the bay window watching the gentle light spill across the lawns. It was Monday, exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The quiet serenity was suddenly broken by the grinding gears of a large commercial moving truck. It parked directly in front of my driveway, its engine rumbling with an invasive energy. The brakes hissed loudly as the driver killed the engine. Behind the moving truck, a sleek silver sedan pulled up to the curb. I watched from the shadows as Lucas stepped out of the driver's side. He was dressed in a sharp business suit, looking every inch the successful corporate executive. Monica emerged from the passenger side clutching her designer handbag, her face set in an expression of grim, determined annoyance. A moment later, a third vehicle arrived. It was Bradley Thorne, the corrupt attorney they had hired to facilitate the fraudulent transfer of my property. He grabbed a thick leather briefcase from his back seat, adjusting his tie with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. They gathered on the sidewalk, exchanging brief, hushed words. They were entirely confident in their victory. They were fully expecting to unlock my front door and find a broken, sobbing old man, surrounded by cheap cardboard boxes, ready to be quietly shipped off to a dark, unmarked grave. They believed they were walking into the final triumphant chapter of their brilliant financial rescue plan. I walked over to my full-length mirror. I was not wearing the faded flannel shirts that had become my daily uniform. Instead, I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, woven from imported Italian wool. It was a garment from my previous life preserved in a hidden cedar closet. I adjusted my collar and tightened the knot of my deep burgundy silk tie. I slipped a vintage platinum watch onto my left wrist, feeling the familiar weight of undeniable wealth. The frail, confused pensioner they thought they had outsmarted no longer existed. I walked out of the bedroom and made my way down the short hallway to the living room. Sylvia Vargas was already waiting for me. She had arrived an hour earlier through the discreet back entrance, accompanied by two imposing, broad-shouldered men wearing immaculate dark suits. Their suit jackets hung open just enough to reveal federal law enforcement badges clipped to their belts. They stood silently behind my favorite leather recliner, exuding an aura of absolute terrifying authority. Sylvia stood beside them holding a sleek silver tablet, her face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. I poured myself a cup of expensive black coffee. I carried the mug to the living room and sat in the leather recliner crossing my legs. The moving boxes I had staged near the window were a perfect piece of theatrical misdirection. We waited in complete, absolute silence. Less than 2 minutes later, I heard the distinct metallic scrape of a key sliding into the front door lock. The heavy wooden door swung inward, hitting the rubber wall stop with a dull thud. Lucas stepped into the foyer first, his shoulders squared, ready to issue commands. Monica followed closely behind him, already pulling a sanitized surgical mask from her purse, as if she were entering a contaminated biohazard zone. Bradley Thorne brought up the rear, his leather briefcase clutched tightly in his hand, ready to present the fraudulent eviction paperwork to any local authorities who might happen to ask questions. "Dad, the moving team is here." Lucas called out, his voice loud and authoritative, completely devoid of the trembling terror I had heard on the audio recordings. "We need you to wrap this up immediately. The transport van for your new medical facility will be arriving in 20 minutes, and we cannot afford any delays." He marched around the corner into the living room, stopping so abruptly that his leather shoes skidded against the hardwood floor. Monica bumped roughly into his back, letting out a sharp gasp of annoyance before she peered around his shoulder. Her eyes widened into massive, terrified circles. The heavy, confident swagger instantly evaporated from both of them. They froze, completely paralyzed by the impossible scene unfolding directly in front of their eyes. I sat perfectly still in the recliner, taking a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. I did not blink. I did not offer a greeting. I simply watched them process the sudden, violent destruction of their reality. Bradley Thorne pushed his way past my paralyzed son, oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He strutted into the center of the living room, dramatically waving a thick stack of legal documents in the air. Mr. Caldwell Bradley announced, his voice dripping with condescension and arrogant legal authority. As per the 72-hour eviction notice served to you on Friday, you are now legally required to vacate these premises immediately. The property has been officially transferred, and you no longer have any legal right to occupy this structure. If you refuse to comply with this order, I will be forced to contact the local sheriff's department to have you physically removed for trespassing. I lowered my coffee mug, resting it gently on my knee. I looked directly at the corrupt attorney, allowing a cold, razor-thin smile to touch the corners of my mouth. You are entirely welcome to contact the local authorities. Mr. Thorne, I replied, my voice smooth, deep, and resonating with absolute command. However, I believe these two gentlemen standing behind me might save you the trouble of making that phone call. Bradley finally stopped waving his papers and looked past me. His arrogant smirk faltered as his eyes locked onto the federal badges glinting under the living room lights. The aggressive color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small. Lucas and Monica remained glued to the floorboards near the foyer archway. Lucas was staring at my custom-tailored suit, his jaw hanging slightly open as his brain desperately tried to reconcile the image of the helpless old man he thought he knew with the powerful, unyielding executive sitting in front of him. Monica was staring at Sylvia, recognizing the distinct, terrifying aura of top-tier corporate power. Lucas, I said, shifting my gaze away from the trembling lawyer and focusing entirely on my son. You look surprised. Did you truly believe I would spend my final days sitting quietly in a dark, unlicensed warehouse near the Mexican border? Did you honestly think I would simply allow you to drug me into an early grave so you could collect a $5 million life insurance payout? Lucas staggered backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He bumped hard into the wall, his breathing turning into shallow, panicked gasps. He knew instantly that I possessed the secret audio recordings. He knew his ultimate deadly betrayal was completely exposed. Monica began to violently shake her designer handbag, slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor. You have precisely 10 seconds to fully explain yourselves, I stated coldly, ending the charade. The silence stretched into a deep, suffocating void. Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat, completely paralyzed by the sheer terrifying magnitude of his catastrophic miscalculation. Monica took a hesitant step backward, pressing herself flat against the drywall, as if she could miraculously merge with the architecture and disappear completely from sight. But my immediate focus was not on my treacherous son. My cold, calculating eyes locked onto the third member of their raiding party. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the corrupt attorney Bradley Thorne, the man who had gleefully facilitated this entire deadly nightmare. The arrogant smirk that had plastered his face moments ago melted away, replaced by the pale sheen of absolute terror. He looked wildly at the federal badges, then down at the eviction papers trembling in his hand, rapidly realizing that he had just walked willingly into a devastating legal meat grinder. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a folded manila envelope. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table separating us. The package landed with a sharp smack against the glass, a sudden noise that made all three of them flinch. I did not need 10 seconds to hear your fabricated excuses. I continued, my voice steady and echoing with the unyielding authority of a judge handing down a terminal sentence. I already know exactly what you have done. Mr. Thorne, let us begin with your contribution to this conspiracy. You drafted the fraudulent power of attorney. You filed the illegal property transfer. You notarized the documents declaring me incompetent and transferring the absolute rights of my residence directly to my son. You stamped those papers with your state-issued seal, legally certifying that I sat in your downtown office last Tuesday afternoon and willingly signed away my earthly estate. I gestured toward the envelope resting on the glass surface. Open it, Bradley. I want you to look at the meticulous work my associates compiled over the past 24 hours. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his tightened silk tie. He took a shaking step forward and reached his trembling hand down for the envelope. His sweating fingers fumbled with the metal clasp before he pulled out the contents. He stared blindly at the scattered high-resolution photographs and the meticulously organized stacks of printed digital data. Those are certified flight manifests, GPS, tracking coordinates, and date-stamped photographs from a private fishing charter located in Juneau, Alaska, I explained calmly, watching the blood drain from his face. Specifically, they are the undeniable records of the official notary public, whose personal signature and state seal you conveniently borrowed for your fraudulent eviction notice. The man who supposedly witnessed my signature last Tuesday was actually sitting on a boat 3,000 miles away, entirely out of cellular range, completely oblivious to the fact that you were actively using his stolen credentials. Bradley staggered backward, as if the glossy photographs were coated in acid. The thick papers slipped from his grip, violently scattering across the expensive living room carpet. "You see, Bradley, you made a catastrophic tactical error," I said, leaning forward in my leather chair, letting my gaze bore directly into his panicked eyes. "You assumed you were dealing with a frightened pensioner who completely lacked the financial resources to legally verify your fraudulent paperwork. You assumed you could fast-track an illegal property seizure because nobody would bother to check the bureaucratic details of a standard eldercare transition. But forging a notary seal to seamlessly facilitate the illegal seizure of a physical asset is not just a minor ethical violation. It is a highly punishable federal crime. When combined with the unauthorized wire transfer of my pension funds that you helped facilitate to cover your illicit fees, you have crossed the permanent threshold into massive federal wire fraud. Furthermore, because of my advanced age, your actions fall under the jurisdiction of severe elder abuse statutes. You actively participated in a coordinated criminal conspiracy to permanently ruin my life. The two federal agents standing silently behind me finally made their presence known. They stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, their overwhelming physical presence suddenly dominating the entire room. The agent on the right, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, placed his hand firmly on his utility belt. "Mr. Thorne." The agent stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that left zero room for negotiation. "We have thoroughly reviewed the preliminary evidence compiled by Mr. Caldwell's legal team. We have secured expedited warrants to freeze your personal bank accounts, seize your digital devices, and audit your entire corporate practice. You are looking at a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary, total professional disbarment, and the absolute destruction of your life." The facade of the confident attorney named Bradley Thorne shattered completely. The heavy leather briefcase he had been clutching dropped from his hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud crash that mirrored his own sudden collapse. His knees buckled, and he sank down onto the expensive Persian rug, his chest heaving with rapid, terrified gasps. He absolutely did not look at my son Lucas. He refused to even glance at Monica. In a matter of seconds, he had ruthlessly abandoned the very clients he had arrogantly conspired to protect. "Please," Bradley begged, holding his trembling hands up toward the towering federal agents, his voice reduced to a high, pathetic whine. "Please, you have to understand my position. I honestly did not know the full, terrifying extent of their deadly plan. I was just processing the standard paperwork. Lucas told me it was a normal family transition. He told me his father was severely ill and needed immediate medical placement. I can give you absolutely everything you need. I have encrypted emails. I have saved text messages. I kept a hidden ledger of their communications. I will testify against both of them right now. I will hand over the complete, highly incriminating paper trail. Just please, I am begging you, grant me full federal immunity. Do not take my legal license. Do not send me to prison. I will tell you absolutely everything about their massive, crippling debts." I watched the once arrogant corporate lawyer weep openly on my living room floor, shamelessly groveling for a shred of mercy he did not deserve. I looked down at him with nothing but pure, icy disdain. I had spent my entire adult life diligently building a solid legacy of honesty, brutal hard work, and quiet, respectable dignity. I had genuinely believed in the fundamental decency of the people around me. But sitting in that chair, watching this pathetic creature beg for his freedom, I realized that some people were simply parasitic insects willing to feed on the vulnerable until they were inevitably crushed. I leaned back into my recliner, smoothly picking up my black coffee. I took a slow sip, perfectly savoring the bitter taste, and looked down at him as if he were nothing more than a speck of dust dirtying my immaculate floor. "Immunity is entirely off the table, Mr. Thorne," I said quietly. "You built your career by preying on the weak. Today, however, you finally made the fatal mistake of preying upon the absolute wrong man." The 10 seconds ticked by in a brutal, agonizing silence. Bradley Thorne remained a crumpled, weeping mess on my Persian rug, while Lucas simply stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant, as if his mind had entirely shut down. It was Monica who finally broke the profound quiet. Her survival instinct, honed by years of corporate ruthlessness and predatory ambition, violently kicked in. She straightened her spine, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse with trembling fingers. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured nail directly at my chest. "You are bluffing!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings and completely shattering the tense atmosphere. "You are a pathetic, delusional old man playing a ridiculous game of dress-up. This house legally belongs to us. We hold the signed property deed. We hold the absolute medical authority over your estate. You have absolutely no power here, Harrison. You have no money, you have no leverage, and you certainly have no right to question our decisions. You are going to get into that transport van, or I swear I will have these officers arrest you for trespassing in my home." I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. Instead, I calmly reached into my suit pocket and withdrew my cellular phone. I tapped the screen once, seamlessly pairing the device with the premium surround sound entertainment system I had installed in the living room years ago. I pressed play. Instantly, the crisp, unmistakable sound of Monica's own voice filled the expansive room, amplified by the hidden acoustic speakers. The audio was pristine, capturing every single inflection of her previous night's conversation. "I found a place," the recorded, Monica stated calmly, her digitized words dropping like heavy stones into the suddenly frozen room. "It is an unlicensed, off-the-grid hospice compound located about 10 miles north of the Mexican border. They cater specifically to families who need their elderly relatives to quietly disappear." Monica physically recoiled as if she had been struck by a whip. She covered her mouth with both hands, a choked guttural sound escaping her throat. I watched Lucas as the recording continued to play, his own hollow, cowardly voice broadcasting his ultimate betrayal to the entire room. But the recording did not stop there. It continued directly into the darkest, most vile segment of their conspiracy. The speakers projected Monica's chilling explanation of the $5 million life insurance policy, her meticulous, premeditated plan to intentionally cause my cardiac failure through aggressive chemical sedation, and her gleeful anticipation of cashing out my life to save their collapsing empire. The color drained entirely from my son's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His knees visibly buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the foyer table to prevent himself from collapsing completely. The horrific reality of his actions, stripped of all internal justifications and played back in high-definition audio, finally crushed whatever remained of his human soul. The two federal agents standing behind me shifted slightly, their hands resting near their tactical belts, entirely prepared for any sudden, desperate movements. I pressed the screen, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. "You thought you were incredibly clever," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a polished razor. "You thought you could treat a human life as a simple, disposable asset on a spreadsheet. You planned to chemically execute your own father to cover your catastrophically stupid financial gambles. You assumed I was deaf-blind and entirely defenseless." I slowly stood up from the leather recliner, buttoning the front of my charcoal jacket. I stood at my full height, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority that Lucas had never seen from me before. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of legal documents. I walked slowly across the Persian rug, stepping carefully around the weeping form of Bradley Thorne, until I stood just a few feet away from my trembling son. "You tried to brutally murder me to pay off a $2.5 million debt." I stated my words, precise and utterly devoid of mercy. "You forged documents, you hired corrupt lawyers, and you planned to toss my body into an unmarked grave to satisfy the violent demands of a Chicago lending syndicate. You believed that $5 million in fraudulent insurance money would perfectly balance your ledger and set you entirely free." I held the thick stack of papers up, letting the morning light catch the harsh, heavy ink of the syndicate's financial contracts. "But you owe the exact wrong people now, Lucas." Lucas stared blindly at the papers, his mind unable to process the shifting landscape of his destruction. "What are those?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a dry, pathetic rasp. "These are the original promissory notes," I explained, tossing the heavy documents onto the glass coffee table where they landed with a definitive final thud. "They are the absolute legally binding contracts detailing every single dollar you borrowed from the Chicago Underground. Early this morning, while you were busy dreaming about your $5 million payout, I instructed Sylvia to contact your lenders. I authorized my private financial team to execute a hostile, immediate buyout of your entire criminal portfolio." Monica let out a sharp, ragged breath, her eyes darting frantically between the documents, the federal agents, and my unyielding face. "A buyout," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "How could you possibly afford a buyout? You are a retired engineer. You live on a fixed pension. We saw your bank accounts. We saw your financial records. You saw the extremely limited financial profile I purposefully curated for public consumption." I corrected her, turning my cold gaze toward her pale, terrified face. "You saw the modest accounts I used to pay for groceries and property taxes. What you did not see, and what your arrogant, superficial greed prevented you from ever discovering, was the massive generational wealth I have quietly managed for decades. I am the sole primary beneficiary of a $90 million corporate trust fund. I have access to capital and resources that you cannot even begin to comprehend." Lucas let out a small, wounded noise, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, devastating magnitude of his mistake. He had traded his father's life and his eternal soul for pennies, completely unaware that he was standing on top of a mountain of gold. "I used a microscopic fraction of my wealth to satisfy the Chicago syndicate," I continued. "I wired $2.5 million directly to their holding accounts. They happily signed over every ounce of leverage they held over your miserable lives. I am your sole absolute creditor," I declared, my voice echoing with finality. "The loan is in default. I am legally exercising my right to initiate immediate asset seizure. I am seizing your expensive downtown penthouse. I am seizing your imported vehicles. I am seizing your margin accounts. You are completely, hopelessly bankrupt. And for your documented, premeditated conspiracy to commit murder, you are both going to federal prison for the rest of your unnatural lives." The absolute finality of my words struck Monica with the physical force of a collapsing building. The carefully constructed facade of the untouchable corporate wife shattered, leaving behind a terrified animal caught in a steel trap. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed violently against the high ceilings. Her knees buckled beneath her expensive skirt, and she collapsed heavily onto the Persian rug, her perfectly manicured hands clawing desperately at the woven fabric. The polished, predatory woman who had coldly calculated the timeline of my chemical execution just hours prior was now reduced to a weeping, hyperventilating mess on my floor. She did not look at me with genuine remorse. Instead, she twisted her tear-streaked face toward her husband, her eyes blazing with a vicious hatred born of pure self-preservation. "This is entirely your fault," Monica screamed, her voice cracking into a ragged, guttural sob. "You told me he was just a clueless old man. You promised me this would be a clean transition. You dragged me into this miserable financial black hole, Lucas. You made me plan this. I never wanted any part of your pathetic family. Lucas did not turn to acknowledge the venomous accusations spewing from his wife's mouth. His entire universe had just been violently inverted. He looked frantically at the legally binding promissory notes resting on the coffee table, then at the towering federal agents standing behind my chair, and finally at my stone-cold face. The realization that he had unknowingly handed his neck to the executioner broke him completely. He fell to his knees. He began to crawl across the distance separating us, his movements desperate and entirely devoid of dignity. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed firmly onto the fabric covering my knees. He looked up at me, his face a wet mask of absolute panic. "Dad, please." Lucas sobbed, his voice reduced to a high, pathetic whimper that made my stomach churn with profound disgust. "Dad, you cannot do this. You cannot send me to federal prison. I am your only boy." I was desperate. I was terrified of the syndicate. They were going to kill me, Dad. They were going to take absolutely everything from me. I panicked. I made a catastrophic mistake, but I am still your flesh and blood. Please, I am begging you, look at me. I am your son. Give me a second chance. I will pay you back every single cent. Just please do not let them take me away. I looked down at the weeping man, clutching desperately at my legs. For a brief second, a ghost of a memory flashed across my mind. I remembered teaching a small, bright-eyed boy how to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, holding him steady and promising I would always keep him safe. But that boy was dead decades ago, replaced by the parasite crying on my floor. My heart felt as cold and impenetrable as solid glacial ice. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt absolutely no hesitation. I reached down, gripped his wrists with a sudden, unyielding strength, and forcefully detached his hands from my suit. I pushed him away, letting him slump backward onto the rug. You stopped being my son the exact moment you priced the remainder of my natural life at $5 million. I stated, my voice echoing with a dark finality. You stopped being my flesh and blood the very second you instructed a transport van to carry me to a border warehouse to be chemically executed. You did not make a mistake, Lucas. You made a deliberate, purely financial choice, and now you are going to pay the exact price for that transaction. I gave a brief, subtle nod to the federal agents standing behind me. The two tall men stepped forward seamlessly, moving with the terrifying efficiency of federal law enforcement. The agent on the left grabbed Lucas by his tailored collar, hauling him roughly to his feet while smoothly sweeping his arms behind his back. The heavy click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly shut echoed sharply through the living room. The second agent approached Monica, ignoring her hysterical thrashing, and firmly secured her wrists in cold steel. Bradley Thorne, still sobbing quietly in the corner, was hauled upward by a third agent who had just entered the foyer, completely securing the treacherous trio. I did not stay to watch them read the formal Miranda rights. I slowly stood up from my leather recliner, taking one final steadying breath. I reached down and calmly buttoned the front of my charcoal gray suit jacket. I turned my back on the ruined remnants of my former family and walked smoothly toward the front door. Sylvia Vargas stepped aside to let me pass, a rare smile of profound professional respect touching her mouth. She fell into step beside me as we exited the house. I walked into the bright morning sunlight. The neighborhood was quiet, entirely indifferent to the massive drama that had just concluded behind my front door. I walked past the large moving truck parked at the curb. The two burly movers hired to empty my house were leaning against the metal bumper, smoking cigarettes and looking deeply confused by the sudden swarm of federal vehicles blocking the street. I did not offer them a single glance. I continued walking with my head held high, my posture straight, and my dignity completely restored. A black town car was idling smoothly near the driveway. The driver scrambled to open the door as I approached. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, inhaling the rich scent of the upholstery. Sylvia climbed into the seat beside me, pulling out her silver tablet to begin untangling the remaining financial wreckage of my former son's broken corporate empire. I looked out the tinted window one final time, gazing at the modest house where I had lived for over 30 years. It held zero sentimental value for me now. It was nothing more than an empty wooden box purged of the toxic parasites who had secretly plotted to drain my life away. The driver engaged the transmission, and the heavy town car glided away from the curb. I left my old house firmly behind, driving confidently toward a brand new life, finally completely free. Family is often described as our safest harbor, but blood alone does not guarantee loyalty. True respect is earned through integrity, not entitlement. When greed overshadows love, even the closest bonds can rot from the inside out. My son believed my age made me weak, and my silence made me foolish. He mistook paternal patience for blind ignorance. The absolute hardest lesson I ever learned was that you cannot save someone actively trying to destroy you. Sometimes stepping away and letting them face the brutal consequences of their own actions is the only way to protect your peace. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever faced a shocking betrayal from someone you trusted implicitly? Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you and stay strong.